The morning mist clung to the hills around Beveridge like a soft grey blanket, and in that mist a small boy walked beside his father down a track worn smooth by countless feet. The boy's name was Edward Kelly, though everyone called him Ned, and he was barely 5 years old when his family first settled in this corner of Victoria, north of Melbourne, in the year 1855. His father, John Kelly, was a man shaped by hardship. Born in County Tipperary, Ireland, he had known hunger and dispossession before he ever saw the Australian shore. The potato famine had driven him from his homeland, along with thousands of others who carried nothing but hope and the memory of green fields. John Kelly was not a large man, but his hands were strong from years of work, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust authority too quickly. Red Kelly, as John was known to his neighbours, had married Ellen Quinn in 1850. Ellen was herself Irish-born, a woman of fierce loyalty and quick temper, with dark hair and eyes that could flash with anger or soften with tenderness. She had borne her first child, Annie, in 1851, and then came Ned in December of 1854, followed by Maggie, then Jim, then Dan, and eventually more children would follow, each one another mouth to feed, another reason to work harder, to hold tighter to whatever small patch of earth they could call their own. The Kelly family had taken up a selection near Beveridge, 43 acres of rough country, where they built a modest slab hut with a bark roof. The selection system was meant to give ordinary people a chance to own land, to break up the vast runs held by wealthy squatters, but the reality was harsh. The soil was often poor, the seasons unpredictable, and the banks unforgiving to those who fell behind on their payments. Young Ned learned early what it meant to work. Before he could properly hold an axe, he was helping his father clear timber, drag logs, build fences from split rails. His small hands grew calloused, his back grew strong, and his eyes learned to read the sky for signs of rain or drought. In the evenings, when the work was done, the family would gather around their rough wooden table, and Ellen would serve whatever she had managed to make from their meagre supplies, damper and tea, perhaps a bit of bacon if times were good, kangaroo stew if Red had been lucky with his gun. It was during these quiet evenings that Ned first heard the stories that would shape his understanding of the world. His parents spoke of Ireland, of landlords who drove families from their homes, of laws that favoured the rich and ground the poor into the dirt. They spoke of the English as oppressors, of a justice system that served only those with money and influence. In the flickering light of their oil lamp, with the Australian bush dark and wild beyond their thin walls, these stories took root in the boy's mind like seeds in fertile soil. Red Kelly was not a criminal by nature, but poverty has a way of blurring the lines between right and wrong. When the family cow wandered onto a neighbour's property and was impounded, Red could not afford the fine to get her back. So he took her anyway, in the dark of night, leading her home through the bush while his children slept. When the local magistrate accused him of stealing a bullock, Red found himself before a court where his word counted for nothing against that of men who wore fine clothes and spoke with educated accents. Ned watched his father endure these humiliations with a growing sense of injustice. He saw how the police treated his family with suspicion, how they were always ready to believe the worst about the Irish Catholics who scraped a living from the hard country. He learned to distrust uniforms, to see authority as something that might protect others, but would likely harm his own family. The boy was not yet 10 when his father died in 1866. Red Kelly had been in and out of jail for minor offences, cattle stealing, unlicensed distilling, and the strain of poverty and legal troubles had worn him down. He fell ill and never recovered, leaving Ellen with 7 children and the selection that was already failing. On the day they buried Red Kelly in the Avenel Cemetery, young Ned stood beside the grave and felt something harden inside his chest. He was 11 years old, the eldest boy in a family that had lost its breadwinner. The responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat, and he accepted it without complaint. From that day forward, he would be the man of the Kelly household, though he was still a child in years. Ellen Kelly was a strong woman, but even the strongest oak can bend only so far before it breaks. With Red gone, she struggled to keep the family together, to make the selection pay, to feed the children who looked to her for everything. She took in washing, sold vegetables from her garden, did whatever work she could find. But it was never enough. The bank payments fell behind, the creditors grew impatient, and slowly the family's grip on their small piece of land began to slip. It was around this time that Ned first met Harry Power, a man whose name was already whispered with fear and fascination throughout the district. Power was a bushranger, one of the last of his kind, a man who had chosen to live outside the law rather than submit to what he saw as an unjust system. He was tall and lean, with greying hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. When he appeared at the Kelly selection one evening, riding a stolen horse and carrying a rifle across his saddle, he brought with him the scent of danger and freedom. Ellen Kelly knew Harry Power from the old country. They were distant relatives, connected by the tangled web of Irish kinship that bound the immigrant community together. When Power asked for shelter, for a meal and a place to rest his horse, Ellen could not refuse. It was the old law of hospitality, stronger than any statute written by colonial legislators. Ned watched from the shadows as Power sat at their table, speaking in low tones with his mother. The bushranger's presence filled the small hut with electricity, with the promise of a life lived on different terms. When Power spoke of the wealthy squatters who controlled vast tracts of land while families like the Kellys struggled for survival, his words echoed the stories Ned had heard since childhood. When he described the corrupt police who served the interests of the rich rather than justice, Ned felt his own experiences confirmed and validated. Before he left, Power looked directly at the boy. "You're Red Kelly's son," he said, and it was not a question. "You've got the look of him about you. Strong hands, steady eyes. If you ever need work, lad, you know where to find me." The offer hung in the air like smoke after Power had ridden away into the darkness. Ned was barely 14, but he was already taller than most grown men, with broad shoulders and hands that could break a horse or split a log with equal ease. He had left school years ago. There was no money for books or proper clothes, and the family needed his labor more than his learning. But he was not stupid. He could read and write well enough, and he had a quick mind that absorbed everything around him. As 1869 gave way to 1870, the Kelly family's situation grew more desperate. The selection was failing, the debts were mounting, and Ellen was finding it harder to keep food on the table. When word came that Harry Power was looking for a young man to ride with him, to help with the horses and act as a lookout, the temptation became impossible to ignore. Ned made his choice on a cold morning in May. He kissed his mother goodbye, shouldered a swag that contained all his worldly possessions, and walked out into the bush to find Harry Power. He was 15 years old, and he believed he was doing what any son should do, whatever was necessary to help his family survive. The apprenticeship with Harry Power would last only a few months, but it would change the course of Ned Kelly's life forever. Power taught him to read the country like a book, to know which tracks led to safety and which to danger. He showed him how to live rough, how to make a camp that left no trace, how to move through the bush without being seen or heard. Most importantly, he taught him that the law was not some sacred principle to be respected, but merely another tool used by the powerful to control the powerless. Together, they held up travelers on the roads around Mansfield and Benalla, taking money and horses from those who looked like they could afford to lose them. Power was always careful to be polite, even courteous, and he never took more than necessary. "We're not common thieves," he would tell Ned. "We're fighting a war, and in war, you take what you need from the enemy." But the partnership was not destined to last. Power was growing old, and the constant pursuit by the police was wearing him down. In April of 1870, both he and Ned were captured by the authorities. Power was tried and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but Ned, because of his youth, was given a more lenient sentence. He spent only 10 weeks in Beechworth jail, but those 10 weeks were enough to complete his education in the harsh realities of colonial justice. In the stone cell that reeked of unwashed bodies and despair, Ned had time to think about his choices, about the path that had led him to this place. He was not sorry for what he had done. His family had needed the money, and he had found a way to get it. But he was sorry to be caught, sorry to be locked away from the free country he loved, sorry to leave his mother and siblings to fend for themselves. When he was finally released, Ned returned to the family selection to find that things had grown even worse in his absence. Ellen had been forced to take in a boarder, a man named George King, who was widely disliked in the district. The children were thinner, their clothes more patched, their faces bearing the pinched look of chronic hunger. The boy who had ridden away with Harry Power returned as a young man who understood that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who had power and those who suffered under it. The Kelly selection at 11 Mile Creek was a small patch of hope carved from an indifferent landscape. When Ned returned from his brief imprisonment, he found his family clinging to that hope with fingers made raw by work and worry. Ellen had managed to keep the selection, but barely, and the cost had been written in the lines around her eyes and the grey threads that had appeared in her dark hair. Maggie, now a young woman of 19, had become her mother's right hand, caring for the younger children and helping with the endless domestic tasks that kept the family functioning. Jim, at 16, was old enough to do a man's work, but still young enough to look to his older brother for guidance. Dan, barely 14, had the same dark eyes as Ned, but a gentler temperament. The younger children, Kate, Grace, and little Tom, looked at their big brother with a mixture of awe and affection, seeing in him both protector and provider. Ned threw himself into the work of the selection with the determination of a man who understood that failure meant his family's destruction. He cleared more land, built better fences, improved the small herd of cattle that represented their only real asset. His hands, already calloused from years of labor, became like leather. His back, broad and strong, bent to tasks that would have broken lesser men. In the evenings, by the light of their oil lamp, he would help the younger children with their letters, determined that they should have the education that circumstances had denied him. But honest work, no matter how hard, was not enough to lift the Kelly family from poverty. The selection was too small, the soil too poor, the market too distant and unpredictable. When their cattle strayed onto neighboring properties, they were impounded and could only be recovered by paying fines that the family could not afford. When they tried to sell their produce, they found themselves at the mercy of buyers who knew they were desperate and negotiated accordingly. It was during this period that Ned first encountered Constable Alexander Fitzpatrick, a young policeman newly assigned to the Greta district. Fitzpatrick was everything that Ned had learned to distrust in authority figures: arrogant, quick to assume guilt in the Irish Catholics under his jurisdiction, and eager to make a name for himself by bringing in criminals real or imagined. From their first meeting, when Fitzpatrick stopped Ned on the road and questioned him about his business with the casual insolence of a man who believed his uniform gave him the right to interrogate anyone he pleased, the two were destined to be enemies. The tension between the Kelly family and the local police was part of a larger conflict that was dividing rural Victoria. The gold rushes of the 1850s had brought thousands of prospectors to the colony. But by the 1870s, most of the easy gold was gone, and many of the miners had turned to farming. The government, eager to break up the large pastoral runs and create a class of small farmers, had introduced the selection system, allowing ordinary people to purchase land at affordable prices. But the squatters, who had controlled vast tracts of land for decades, did not give up easily. They used their wealth and political influence to make life difficult for the selectors, and they were often aided by a police force that shared their social background and sympathies. The result was a simmering conflict between the established landowners and the struggling selectors, many of whom were Irish Catholics, like the Kellys. In this charged atmosphere, any dispute could escalate quickly into something larger. When Ned Kelly and his friend Isaiah Wild Wright were accused of stealing a horse from one of the local squatters, it was more than just a criminal charge. It was another skirmish in the ongoing war between rich and poor, Protestant and Catholic, established authority, and those who challenged it. The case dragged on for months, and though Ned was eventually acquitted for lack of evidence, The experience left him with an even deeper distrust of the legal system. He had seen how the prosecution relied on dubious testimony from witnesses who had clear motives to lie. He had watched respectable citizens nod in approval when the prosecutor painted him as a dangerous criminal simply because of his family name and his brief association with Harry Power. He had felt the weight of a system that assumed his guilt and required him to prove his innocence. More trials followed. Ned found himself repeatedly hauled before magistrates on charges that ranged from the serious to the trivial. He was accused of sending indecent letters to the wife of a local official, of assaulting a Chinese man, of drunk and disorderly conduct. Some of these charges stuck, others didn't, but the pattern was clear. The authorities had marked him as a troublemaker, and they were determined to make his life as difficult as possible. The young man who had once dreamed of lifting his family from poverty through honest work began to understand that the system would never allow such a thing. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how carefully he followed the law, he would always be viewed with suspicion, always be one step away from another cell, another fine he could not pay, another humiliation at the hands of men who thought themselves his betters. It was during one of these court appearances that Ned met a man who would become both friend and fellow outlaw. Joe Byrne was a few years younger than Ned, but he had already established himself as someone who would not be pushed around. The son of Irish immigrants like Ned, Joe had received a better education and could quote poetry as easily as he could track a horse through difficult country. He was slender, where Ned was broad, quick-witted, where Ned was thoughtful. But they shared the same sense of injustice, the same refusal to accept the role that society had assigned them. Joe's best friend was Steve Hart, a young man of English descent who had nonetheless thrown in his lot with the Irish community around Greta. Steve was the youngest of the group, barely out of his teens, but he had already shown that he possessed both the courage and the recklessness that would be essential in the trials to come. He was an excellent horseman and an even better shot, skills that had been honed through years of hunting in the dense forests of the King Valley. The fourth member of what would become the Kelly gang was Ned's own younger brother, Dan. At 18, Dan Kelly was tall and lean like his older brother, with the same dark eyes and the same quick temper when roused. He idolized Ned and would follow him anywhere, a loyalty that both touched and worried the older Kelly brother. Ned had chosen his own path, knowing the risks, but he had not wanted to drag his family deeper into conflict with the law. But the choice was being taken from them. The police harassment of the Kelly family had intensified to the point where even the younger children were afraid to leave the selection. Constable Fitzpatrick seemed to take personal pleasure in making their lives difficult, appearing at their door at all hours with warrants and accusations, treating their home as if it were enemy territory to be occupied rather than the sanctuary of a law-abiding family. Ellen Kelly bore these intrusions with the stoic dignity of a woman who had endured much worse, but Ned could see the toll they were taking. His mother was growing thinner, more careworn, and he often caught her staring out at the bush with the look of someone who was contemplating impossible choices. The younger children, who should have been carefree and happy, had learned to watch the roads with anxious eyes, ready to run and hide at the first sight of a police uniform. The breaking point came in April of 1878, on a day when the autumn air was crisp and clear, and the leaves on the stringybarks were just beginning to turn. Ned was working in the paddock, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by the winter storms, when he saw a rider approaching the house. Even at a distance, he recognized the arrogant posture of Constable Fitzpatrick. Dropping his tools, Ned jogged toward the house, arriving just as Fitzpatrick dismounted and approached the front door. Ellen Kelly emerged to meet him, her face set in the neutral expression she wore whenever dealing with the police. Behind her, Ned could see his sister Kate and the younger children watching from the shadows of the doorway. "Mrs. Kelly," Fitzpatrick said, touching his cap in a mockery of respect, "I have a warrant for the arrest of Daniel Kelly on charges of horse stealing." "Dan's not here," Ellen replied, which was true. Dan and his friends had gone hunting in the high country and were not expected back for several days. "Then I'll wait," Fitzpatrick said, settling himself on the veranda as if he owned the place. "I have time." What followed was a confrontation that would be remembered and disputed for generations. According to Fitzpatrick's later testimony, Dan Kelly returned unexpectedly and fired a shot at him, wounding him in the wrist. According to the Kelly family, Fitzpatrick spent the evening drinking with them, tried to assault Kate Kelly, and was driven off after a scuffle in which no shots were fired and no one was seriously injured. The truth, as it often does, probably lay somewhere between these two versions. But what mattered wasn't what actually happened, but what Fitzpatrick claimed had happened when he rode back to Benalla with his story of attempted murder and the Kelly gang's descent into open warfare against the authorities. Within days, warrants were issued for the arrest of Ned and Dan Kelly on charges of attempted murder. The rewards posted for their capture, 100 each, dead or alive, marked them as dangerous criminals in the eyes of the law and fair game for any ambitious constable or greedy citizen. Ned Kelly was 23 years old, a man in his prime, with hands that could gentle a wild horse or split a log with a single blow. He had tried to live within the law, had worked honest jobs, and paid his debts and protected his family as best he could. But the law had offered him nothing but suspicion and harassment, and now it was demanding his life in payment for a crime he insisted he had not committed. Standing in the yard of the Selection that had been his world, looking at the bush that stretched away to the horizon, Ned Kelly made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He would not surrender himself to a system that had already judged him guilty. He would not trust his fate to courts that had shown him nothing but prejudice and hostility. Instead, he would take to the bush, would become what they had already called him, an outlaw. The decision, once made, brought a strange sense of peace. The pretense was over. The struggle to live respectably in a system that would never accept him was at an end. He was free now, free to fight back against those who had made his life a misery, free to live by his own rules in the wild country that had always been his true home. But first, there were preparations to make, weapons to gather, supplies to collect, allies to inform of his decision, and there were goodbyes to say, though he could not know that this would be the last time he would see his mother as a free man. The last time he would stand in the doorway of the simple hut that had sheltered his childhood. Ellen Kelly stood on the veranda and watched her eldest son prepare to disappear into the bush that had given birth to him. She did not try to stop him. She knew as well as he did that he had no choice, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the breaking of her heart. "Be careful, Ned," she said. "Come home when you can." He kissed her forehead, embraced his younger siblings, and then turned away toward the dark line of the trees. Behind him, the oil lamp still burned in the window of the Kelly selection, a small point of light in the vast darkness of the Australian night. Ahead lay the unknown, the dangerous freedom of the bush, and a destiny that would make his name immortal. The Wombat Ranges stretched away from the Kelly selection like a great green sea, their ridges rolling one after another into the blue distance. It was here, in country that was both familiar and wild, that Ned Kelly began his life as an outlaw. The year was 1878, and the season was autumn, when the light slanted golden through the stringy barks, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and distant rain. With him came his younger brother, Dan, loyal and unquestioning, ready to follow wherever Ned might lead. Dan Kelly was 20 years old, tall and lean like his brother, with the same dark eyes that could flash with anger or soften with affection. He had grown up in Ned's shadow, and now that shadow had become a refuge from the harsh light of the law's attention. They were joined by Joe Byrne, the educated son of Irish immigrants who could quote Byron and Shelley between sessions of tracking stolen horses through the bush. Joe was slightly built, but tough as whipcord, with a quick mind and an even quicker temper. He had his own reasons for taking to the bush, his own conflicts with the police, his own understanding that the system would never offer men like him a fair chance. The fourth member of their small band was Steve Hart, the youngest of them all at barely 19. Steve was the only one who was not Irish, but he had grown up among the Irish community around the King Valley and had adopted their grievances as his own. He was a superb horseman and an excellent shot, skills that would prove invaluable in the dangerous game they were about to play. Together, they made their way deeper into the ranges, following tracks that were known only to local men who had spent their lives hunting and timber cutting in this rugged country. The bush closed around them like a protective embrace, offering them sanctuary from the civilization that had rejected them. Here, among the giant tree ferns and the moss-covered logs, beneath canopies of leaves that filtered the sunlight into 1,000 shades of green, they began to learn what it meant to live entirely outside the law. Their first camp was established in a natural clearing beside a creek that ran clear and cold from the high country. They built no permanent structures, for permanence was a luxury they could not afford. Instead, they lived like the Aboriginal people who had once hunted in these same valleys, moving frequently, leaving no trace of their passage, becoming part of the landscape rather than trying to impose themselves upon it. Ned Kelly had learned bushcraft from his childhood, but now he refined those skills to a level that approached artistry. He could read the country like a book, understanding from the bend of grass or the call of a bird whether danger was approaching. He could track a horse through country that looked trackless to untrained eyes, and he could move through the densest scrub without making a sound that would carry to hostile ears. The others learned from him, and he from them. Joe Byrne's education proved valuable in ways that went beyond book learning. He understood the broader political currents that were shaping their situation, could place their personal struggles within the context of the ancient conflict between rich and poor, conqueror and conquered. Steve Hart's knowledge of the King Valley and its network of sympathizers opened up new possibilities for movement and supply. Dan Kelly's unquestioning loyalty provided Ned with the assurance that whatever happened, he would not face it alone. But they were not merely hiding in the bush like common criminals. From the beginning, Ned Kelly understood that their situation was different, that they were engaged in something larger than personal survival. They were at war, he believed, with a system that had driven them into the ranges through its own injustice and persecution. And in war, one did not merely defend, one attacked. Their first target was a group of 4 policemen who had been sent into the ranges to hunt them down. Constables McIntyre, Scanlon, Lonergan, and Kennedy represented everything that the Kelly gang had come to despise about colonial law enforcement. They were young men, most of them, eager to make their reputations by bringing in the famous outlaws, dead or alive. They were well-armed and confident, and they believed that their uniforms and their official authority would be enough to cow a group of young Irish Catholics who had dared to defy the established order. The confrontation came at a place called Stringybark Creek in October of 1878, when the wattle was blooming gold and the magpies were calling their liquid songs from the treetops. The police had made their camp in a small clearing, confident in their strength and convinced that the outlaws would not dare to attack uniformed representatives of the Crown. But Ned Kelly had been watching them for days, studying their movements, learning their habits, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew that this confrontation would define everything that followed, that success would establish the Kelly gang as a force to be reckoned with, while failure would mean death or capture and the end of their brief moment of freedom. On the morning of October 26th, when the mist still clung to the creek and the air was sharp with cold, the Kelly gang began their approach to the police camp. They moved like shadows through the timber, their faces blackened with charcoal, their weapons ready, their hearts beating with the terrible excitement of men who were about to cross a line from which there could be no return. McIntyre and Scanlon were in the camp when the attack began. The other 2 constables, Kennedy and Lonergan, had gone out to hunt for the outlaws, leaving their companions to guard the supplies and horses. It was a fatal division of their force, exactly what Ned Kelly had been waiting for. "Surrender!" Ned called from the edge of the clearing, his rifle trained on the 2 startled policemen. "Throw down your arms!" For a moment that stretched like eternity, the 2 groups faced each other across the small clearing. The police, trained to see themselves as representatives of order and authority, could not quite believe that they were being challenged so directly. The outlaws, committed now to their course of action, waited with the patience of hunters for their quarry to make the wrong move. It was Lonergan who broke the spell. Instead of surrendering, he reached for his rifle, and in that instant, the careful balance tipped toward violence. Ned Kelly's rifle spoke first, and Constable Lonergan fell dead among the wattle blossoms, his blood dark against the yellow flowers. McIntyre, seeing his companion fall, ran for the cover of the trees. He was young and fast, and fear gave wings to his feet as he crashed through the undergrowth, seeking escape from what had become a battlefield. Behind him, he could hear the shouts of the outlaws, the crack of rifles, the confused sounds of a fight that had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. Scanlan, braver or perhaps more foolish than his fleeing companion, tried to make a stand. He had his rifle in his hands and was attempting to find cover behind a fallen log when Steve Hart's bullet found him. He died there among the debris of the forest floor, another casualty in a war that neither side had really wanted, but both had found impossible to avoid. When Kennedy returned to the camp later that day, he found death waiting for him. The outlaws had prepared an ambush, and despite his skill and courage, he had no chance against 4 desperate men who had already killed twice and knew that their own lives depended on leaving no witnesses. He fell at the edge of the clearing where his companions had made their last camp, and with him died any possibility of the Kelly gang's return to peaceful existence. Only McIntyre escaped to carry the news back to civilization, and his testimony would paint the Kelly gang as cold-blooded murderers who had killed 3 brave policemen in the performance of their duty. The newspapers would seize upon the story, creating a narrative of heroic constables struck down by treacherous bushrangers. The government would increase the rewards for the outlaws' capture to £2,000 each, making them the most wanted men in Australia. But in the quiet aftermath of the violence at Stringybark Creek, as the Kelly gang stood among the bodies of the men they had killed, a different understanding took shape. They had crossed the line from which there was no return. They were no longer men seeking to escape injustice. They were outlaws in the fullest sense of the word, men who lived entirely outside the protection of the law and who could expect no mercy if they were ever taken alive. Ned Kelly looked down at the dead policeman and felt no satisfaction, only a grim recognition of necessity. These men had come hunting him like a wild animal, armed with rifles and official sanction to kill. He had simply been quicker and more ruthless than they were. In the harsh arithmetic of survival, that made him the victor. But it also made him something he had never intended to become: a killer. The Kelly gang buried the 3 policemen where they had fallen, not out of respect, but out of practical necessity. Bodies left above ground would attract attention, and attention was the one thing they could not afford. Then they broke camp and melted back into the bush, leaving behind only the memory of violence and the knowledge that the stakes in their game of survival had just become deadly. Word of the killings spread through the district like wildfire. To the authorities, the Kelly gang had revealed themselves as dangerous criminals who would stop at nothing to avoid capture. To the Irish Catholic community from which they had sprung, they had become something more complex, both heroes and cautionary tale. Men who had refused to be ground down by an unjust system, but who had paid a terrible price for their defiance. The hunt for the Kelly gang intensified. Police poured into the region from Melbourne and other districts, armed with the latest rifles and backed by the full authority of the colonial government. Aboriginal trackers were brought in to follow the outlaws' trail through country that seemed impenetrable to European eyes. Rewards were posted not just for the outlaws themselves, but for information leading to their capture, turning neighbor against neighbor and creating a climate of suspicion and fear. But the bush was vast, and the Kelly gang knew it better than their pursuers. They moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few days, always keeping to the high country where the timber was thick and the trails were known only to local men. They had allies among the Selector families who saw them not as criminals, but as fellow victims of an oppressive system. Food and information flowed to them through networks of kinship and sympathy that the police could never fully penetrate. In their camps by hidden creeks beside fires that were carefully shielded from prying eyes, the four outlaws began to evolve from desperate fugitives into something approaching a military unit. Ned Kelly emerged as their natural leader, not just because he was the eldest, but because he possessed the combination of physical courage, strategic thinking, and moral authority that made others willing to follow him into danger. Under his guidance, they developed the skills and tactics that would make them the most formidable bushrangers in Australian history. They learned to move like ghosts through country that their pursuers found impossible to navigate. They perfected the art of appearing suddenly where they were not expected, striking quickly and vanishing before effective resistance could be organized. But perhaps most importantly, they began to develop the ideology that would set them apart from common criminals. In the long evenings around their carefully concealed campfires, Ned Kelly began to articulate a vision of their struggle that went beyond mere survival. They were not just outlaws, he argued. They were soldiers in a war between the oppressed and their oppressors, representatives of all those who had been ground down by an unjust system. This vision would sustain them through the hardships and dangers that lay ahead. It would give meaning to their suffering and nobility to their resistance. It would transform them from desperate men on the run into symbols of defiance that would inspire some and terrify others long after their bodies had been laid to rest. But for now, in the autumn of 1878, they were simply 4 young men alone in the vast Australian bush, hunted by hundreds of armed men and sustained only by their loyalty to each other and their refusal to surrender to what they saw as injustice. The fire crackled softly in their hidden camp. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them with their ancient music, and somewhere in the darkness, beyond their circle of light, the future waited with all its unknown perils and possibilities. Winter came early to the ranges that year, bringing with it cold rains that turned the tracks to mud and mist that clung to the valleys like grey wool. For the Kelly gang, winter was both enemy and ally. Enemy because it made their already difficult existence even more harsh. Ally because it provided cover for their movements and made the task of their pursuers almost impossible. In the months following Stringybark Creek, the four outlaws learned to live like creatures of the wild country itself. They slept in caves carved from granite by ancient waters, in hollow logs that had fallen centuries ago, in shelters woven from bark and bracken that could be abandoned at a moment's notice. They ate what the bush provided, kangaroo and wallaby when they could risk a shot, native fruits and roots when they could not, damper baked in the coals of fires that were built only when the weather would disperse the smoke. Ned Kelly, as the leader of the group, felt the weight of their survival pressing on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every decision he made, where to camp, when to move, which tracks to follow, could mean the difference between life and death for the men who trusted him. In the grey light of dawn, when the others were still sleeping and the world was hushed with cold, he would sit watch and feel the loneliness of command settling around him like a cloak. But they were not entirely alone in the wilderness. The network of sympathizers that had begun to form around them grew stronger through the winter months, sustained by a combination of kinship, shared grievance, and genuine admiration for men who had refused to be broken by the system. Selector families throughout the region provided them with food, information, and occasional shelter, risking their own freedom to aid the outlaws they had come to see as champions of their cause. Tom Lloyd, Ellen Kelly's nephew, became one of their most reliable allies. A young man of about Ned's age, Tom possessed both the courage and the bush skills necessary to maintain contact with the gang during their most dangerous period. He would appear at their camps like a ghost, bringing news from the outside world, supplies carefully gathered from sympathetic families, and messages from Ellen Kelly that her sons treasured more than gold. Through Tom and others like him, the outlaws learned that their situation was more complex than they had imagined. The authorities had indeed branded them as murderers and increased the price on their heads to levels that made them attractive quarry for every ambitious constable and greedy citizen in the colony. But among the common people, particularly the Irish Catholic selectors who shared their background and grievances, they were becoming something approaching folk heroes. Stories of their exploits spread through the district like ripples on water, growing with each telling until fact and legend became impossible to separate. They were said to be able to disappear into thin air, to move through country without leaving tracks, to appear suddenly where they were least expected and vanish before pursuit could be organized. Some claimed they had supernatural powers, others that they were protected by the spirits of the land itself. Ned Kelly understood the power of these stories, and he began to shape them consciously, creating a mythology around the Kelly gang that served their practical needs, while also expressing his deepening sense of their struggle's larger meaning. When they did venture from their hidden camps to obtain supplies or gather information, they made sure to conduct themselves in ways that would enhance their reputation among the people whose support they needed. They were unfailingly polite to women and children, never taking more than they needed, always paying when they could, and leaving IOUs when they couldn't. They helped Selector families with difficult tasks, shared their food with those who had less, and used their growing reputation to protect the innocent from the harassment of overzealous police. At the same time, they made it clear that they would show no mercy to those who actively opposed them. Police informants found their property mysteriously damaged, their livestock scattered, their lives made difficult in ways that could never be traced back to the outlaws, but were clearly connected to their cooperation with the authorities. The message was clear. The Kelly gang had many eyes and long arms, and those who betrayed them did so at their own peril. The winter of 1878 passed slowly, each day blending into the next in a rhythm of survival that became almost meditative in its intensity. Rise before dawn, check the approaches to their camp, tend to the horses that were their lifeline to freedom. Share a meager breakfast of damper and tea, then move deeper into the ranges, always alert for the signs that would warn them of approaching danger. During the long afternoons, when they were forced to remain hidden while police patrols searched the lower country, they talked. Joe Byrne would recite poetry from memory, his educated voice lending dignity to verses that seemed to speak directly to their situation. Steve Hart would tell stories of his childhood in the King Valley, painting pictures of a simpler time when the greatest dangers were natural ones, floods, fires, snakes, that could be faced with courage and skill rather than the complex web of politics and law that now entangled them. Dan Kelly, the youngest and most thoughtful of them, often sat quietly during these conversations, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he absorbed the words of his companions. Sometimes Ned would catch him staring into the flames with an expression of such sadness that it made the older brother's heart ache. Dan had not chosen this life. He had been swept into it by circumstances and loyalty, and Ned sometimes wondered if the boy regretted the path that had led them all so far from home. But when Dan spoke, it was always with fierce loyalty to their cause and unwavering faith in Ned's leadership. He had grown from a boy into a man during their months in the bush, his body hardening with the constant physical demands of their existence, his mind sharpening with the need to stay constantly alert to danger. The sweet-natured youngest son of Ellen Kelly was becoming a formidable outlaw in his own right, capable of the same ruthless efficiency that had made their survival possible. As winter gave way to spring, the Kelly gang began to plan their next move. They could not remain hidden in the ranges forever. Eventually, the constant pressure of the police search would force them into a mistake, or their network of supporters would be broken by arrests and intimidation. They needed to strike back, to demonstrate that they were still a force to be reckoned with, to show both their enemies and their supporters that the Kelly gang was far from defeated. The target they chose was the town of Euroa, a prosperous farming community about 60 miles north of Melbourne. It was large enough to contain substantial amounts of money and supplies, small enough to be easily controlled by 4 determined men, and symbolically significant as a place where the wealthy squatters and prosperous merchants who profited from the current system made their homes. The raid on Euroa, carried out in December of 1878, was a masterpiece of planning and execution that demonstrated the Kelly gang's evolution from desperate fugitives into something approaching a guerrilla army. They entered the town in broad daylight, not as skulking criminals, but as confident men who had come to conduct business on their own terms. Ned Kelly wore a long coat that concealed his weapons, but could not hide his commanding presence. At 24, he had grown into his full strength, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His dark eyes surveyed the town with the calculating gaze of a general examining a battlefield, noting exits and advantages, potential threats and opportunities. The gang's first stop was the local police station, where they surprised and disarmed the duty constable before he could raise an alarm. They tied him up and left him in his cell, unharmed but effectively neutralized. It was typical of their approach during this period. Violence only when necessary, courtesy whenever possible, but absolute determination to achieve their objectives. From the police station, they moved to the bank, where they found more substantial resistance. The bank manager, a middle-aged man named Scott, initially refused to open the safe, declaring that he would rather die than surrender the money entrusted to his care. It was exactly the sort of righteous defiance that Ned Kelly had come to expect from representatives of the system he opposed. "You're a brave man," Ned told him, his voice carrying the sort of calm authority that made other men listen. "But you're also a foolish one. That money doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the men who put their sweat into earning it. We're not stealing it. We're redistributing it to those who need it more." Whether it was the logic of Ned's argument or the practical recognition the resistance was futile, Scott eventually agreed to open the safe. The gang made off with over £2,000, a substantial sum that would keep them supplied for months, while also demonstrating their ability to strike at the heart of the financial system that oppressed their people. But the money was only part of the story. More important was the manner in which the raid was conducted, with a combination of daring and courtesy that enhanced the gang's growing reputation. They had held an entire town for several hours without firing a shot or harming a single person. They had demonstrated that the forces of law and order were powerless to protect even the most prosperous communities from determined men who knew the country and had the support of the people. News of the Euroa raid spread throughout the colony like wildfire, confirming the Kelly gang's status as the most notorious outlaws in Australian history. The authorities responded with predictable fury, increasing the rewards for their capture and flooding the region with additional police. But the very scale of their response served to enhance the gang's reputation, suggesting that 4 young men from the Selector country had become a threat to the entire established order. In the weeks following Euroa, the Kelly gang retreated once again to their mountain strongholds. But they were no longer the desperate fugitives who had fled into the bush after Stringybark Creek. They had proven their ability to strike where and when they chose, to thumb their noses at authority while conducting themselves with a dignity that won them admiration even from their enemies. The money from Euroa allowed them to improve their equipment and expand their network of supporters. They purchased better weapons, warmer clothing, and medical supplies that had been desperately needed during the harsh winter months. More importantly, they were able to provide financial assistance to sympathetic families whose support had been crucial to their survival, strengthening the bonds of loyalty that protected them from betrayal. Through the long summer days of early 1879, they moved through their domain like kings in exile, appearing where they were least expected, vanishing before effective pursuit could be organized. Police patrols would arrive at reported sightings to find only cold campfires and the lingering sense that they had been watched and evaluated by invisible eyes. The psychological effect of their continued freedom began to wear on their pursuers. Police morale suffered as patrol after patrol returned empty-handed from expeditions into the ranges. The press began to question the competence of the authorities, wondering aloud how 4 young men could continue to evade the hundreds of police officers and trackers who had been assigned to capture them. But the Kelly gang paid a price for their growing fame. The constant stress of being hunted, the need to remain always alert to danger, the isolation from family and friends, all of these took their toll on men who were still young enough to dream of normal lives. In quiet moments around their carefully concealed campfires, they spoke of the future with a mixture of hope and resignation, knowing that their current existence could not continue indefinitely, but uncertain what alternative might be possible. Ned Kelly, in particular, felt the burden of their situation weighing heavily on his shoulders. He had led his brother and friends into a life of constant danger, and while they had achieved a kind of glory, it was glory purchased at a price that grew heavier with each passing day. The boy who had once dreamed of lifting his family from poverty through honest work had become a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and inspired desperate hope in the hearts of his supporters. As autumn approached again, bringing with it the anniversary of their first year as outlaws, the Kelly gang began to plan their next major action. They had proven they could survive in the bush, had demonstrated their ability to strike at their enemies, had built a network of support that stretched throughout the region. But survival was not enough. They needed to make a statement that would force the world to understand their struggle, to see them not as common criminals, but as men fighting for justice in the only way left to them. The plan that began to take shape in Ned Kelly's mind was audacious beyond anything they had previously attempted. It would require all their skill, all their courage, and all the support they could gather from their sympathizers. If it succeeded, it would establish them forever as champions of the oppressed. If it failed, it would almost certainly mean their deaths. But first, there was a letter to write, a document that would explain to the world who they were and why they had chosen the path they had taken. In the flickering light of their mountain campfire, surrounded by the vast silence of the Australian bush, Ned Kelly began to compose what would become known as the Jerilderie Letter, his testament to history and his challenge to those who had driven him beyond the boundaries of the law. In the autumn of 1879, when the leaves on the river Red Gums were turning gold and the morning air carried the sharp promise of winter, Ned Kelly sat beside a creek in the Warby Ranges and began to write. The paper was rough, the ink homemade from the charcoal of their campfire mixed with water, but the words that flowed from his pen carried the weight of accumulated grievance and the power of a man who had found his voice at last. The letter that would become known to history as the Jerilderie Letter was more than a mere document. It was a manifesto, a declaration of war, and a plea for understanding all rolled into one. In the careful script that his mother had taught him as a child, Ned Kelly began to tell his version of the story that had brought him to this place, this moment, this desperate bid to make himself heard above the chorus of condemnation that surrounded his name. I wish to acquaint you with some of the occurrences of the present past, and it will be a guide for the future, he began, and in that simple opening lay the heart of his purpose. He was not content to be remembered merely as a criminal, a troublemaker, a man who had chosen violence over submission. He wanted the world to understand the forces that had shaped him, the injustices that had driven him to take up arms against the established order. The writing came slowly at first, hampered by the inadequate materials and the need to remain constantly alert for danger. But as the words began to flow, they carried with them all the pent-up frustration and anger of a man who had spent his entire life watching the system grind down those he loved. Page after page, filled with his careful script, each word chosen with the precision of a man who understood that this might be his only chance to speak directly to history. He wrote of his childhood, of the poverty that had stalked the Kelly family like a shadow, of the constant harassment by police who saw Irish Catholics as natural criminals. He wrote of his father's death, of his mother's struggles to keep the family together, of his own efforts to live within the law despite the system's determination to treat him as an outlaw. "The police never have shown me any kindness," he wrote, "but rather have treated me like a black snake, which is poisonous and must be killed at first sight." The metaphor was apt. He had become dangerous, not by choice, but by necessity, transformed into something feared and hunted by the very forces that had created him. Most of all, he wrote of injustice, the corruption of magistrates who favored the wealthy over the poor, the brutality of police who saw their uniforms as licenses to abuse those who could not fight back, the hypocrisy of a system that preached law and order while practicing oppression and exploitation. His anger burned through the pages like fire, controlled but intense, the anger of a man who had seen too much and suffered too long in silence. But the letter was more than an indictment of the past. It was also a vision of the future, a promise of retribution for those who had wronged him and his people. "I will fight to the last drop of blood," he declared, and those who knew him understood that it was not an empty threat, but a solemn vow from a man who had already proven his willingness to die for his principles. The writing of the letter took several weeks, interrupted by the constant need to move camp, to evade police patrols, to attend to the practical business of survival. But when it was finally complete, it represented something unprecedented in Australian history, a document written by an outlaw that attempted to justify his actions not merely in terms of personal grievance, but as part of a broader struggle between rich and poor, oppressor and oppressed. The letter was more than 8,000 words long, a testament to both Ned Kelly's literacy and his passion for his cause. But writing it was only the first step. It also had to be delivered, published, made available to the public whose understanding he sought. And that would require another audacious raid, another demonstration of the Kelly gang's ability to strike where and when they chose. The target they selected was the town of Jerilderie, a prosperous community in New South Wales, just across the border from Victoria. It was chosen partly for practical reasons. It was far enough from their usual haunts to surprise the authorities, prosperous enough to make the raid worthwhile, but also for symbolic ones. By crossing into another colony, they would demonstrate that their struggle could not be contained within the borders of Victoria, that their cause had implications for all of Australia. The raid on Jerilderie, carried out in February of 1879, was perhaps the Kelly gang's finest hour, a perfect fusion of military precision and theatrical flair that captured the imagination of the entire continent. They entered the town not as skulking criminals, but as conquering heroes, riding down the main street in broad daylight with the confidence of men who feared nothing that their enemies could do to them. Their first stop was the police station, where they surprised and captured the 2 duty constables, locking them in their own cells after relieving them of their uniforms. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. The hunters had become the hunted. The forces of law and order had been reduced to helpless prisoners in their own stronghold. Steve Hart and Dan Kelly donned the captured police uniforms and spent the next day patrolling the town, arresting drunks and maintaining order with the efficiency that mocked the real police's claims of competence. The sight of Kelly gang members wearing police uniforms, enforcing the law with gentle humor while their brothers robbed the bank, became one of the most memorable images of the entire Kelly saga. Meanwhile, Ned Kelly and Joe Byrne made their way to the bank, where they repeated their previous success with even greater style. The bank manager, learning from his colleague's experience at Euroa, offered no resistance, and the gang made off with over £2,000 in cash and negotiable securities. But once again, the money was only part of the story. More important was the manner in which they comported themselves during their brief occupation of the town. They were courteous to women and children, generous to those in need, and careful to avoid any unnecessary violence. When they discovered that one of the constables they had captured was married with small children, they made sure his family was provided for during his temporary imprisonment. It was during the Jerilderie raid that Ned Kelly made his most determined effort to distribute copies of his letter to the public. He approached the editor of the local newspaper, a man named Samuel Gill, and attempted to convince him to publish the document in its entirety. Gill, perhaps intimidated by the outlaw's presence or skeptical of his claims, agreed to accept the letter, but made no firm commitment to publish it. In the end, only a few excerpts from the Jerilderie Letter ever appeared in print during Ned Kelly's lifetime, robbing him of the opportunity to make his case directly to the Australian people. The full text would not be published until decades after his death, when it would be recognised as one of the most remarkable documents in Australian literature, part autobiography, part political manifesto, part cry of anguish from a man who felt himself trapped by forces beyond his control. But even without wide publication, the letter served its purpose in establishing Ned Kelly as something more than a common criminal. Those who did read it or heard it read aloud in the Selector settlements and Irish Catholic communities throughout the region understood that they were encountering a voice unlike any that had previously emerged from the Australian bush, educated enough to express complex ideas, passionate enough to move hearts, and angry enough to challenge the entire established order. The success of the Jerilderie raid, coming so soon after Euroa, established the Kelly gang as the most formidable outlaws in Australian history. They had now held 2 towns, robbed 2 banks, evaded capture for more than a year, and demonstrated their ability to strike anywhere at any time. The authorities responded with predictable fury, flooding the region with additional police and trackers, increasing the rewards for their capture to levels that made them more valuable than gold. But the very scale of the official response served to enhance the gang's reputation among their supporters. Here were 4 young men who had forced the entire colonial establishment to take notice, who had made their grievances a matter of public debate, who had proven that even the most powerful institutions were vulnerable to determined resistance. In the months following Jerilderie, the Kelly gang once again retreated to their mountain strongholds, but they carried with them the knowledge that they had achieved something remarkable. They had forced the world to listen to their story, had demonstrated that the poor and oppressed could fight back against their oppressors, had become symbols of resistance that would inspire others long after their own struggle had ended. But they also understood that their time was running short. The pressure of the police pursuit was becoming unbearable. Their network of supporters was being steadily eroded by arrests and intimidation, and the constant stress of life on the run was beginning to take its toll on men who were still young enough to dream of normal lives. In the hidden camps where they spent the winter of 1879, the 4 outlaws began to discuss plans for what they all understood might be their final stand. They had proven their courage, demonstrated their principles, and made their mark on history. Now they faced the question that had haunted them since their first days in the bush: how to end their story in a way that would give meaning to all they had sacrificed. The plan that began to take shape in Ned Kelly's mind was as audacious as anything they had previously attempted. It involved not merely another bank robbery or town raid, but a complete overthrow of the established order in their region, the establishment of a republic where men like themselves could live free from the oppression they had endured all their lives. It was a dream born of desperation and sustained by courage, a plan that required them to transform themselves from outlaws into revolutionary soldiers. At its heart lay a scheme so bold that even their enemies would be forced to acknowledge its ambition: the creation of armor that would make them invulnerable to their enemies' bullets, and the establishment of a stronghold that would become the capital of their new republic. As winter gave way to spring in 1880, the Kelly gang began to prepare for what they all understood would be either their greatest triumph or their final defeat. In hidden forges throughout the region, sympathetic blacksmiths began to fashion the iron plates that would transform them from mortal men into something approaching mythical warriors. In secret meetings with their most trusted supporters, plans were laid for an uprising that would either free their people from oppression or provide them with a glorious martyrdom. The boy, who had once walked beside his father down the track to Beveridge, had become a man who dreamed of kingdoms. The desperate fugitive who had fled into the bush after Stringybark Creek had evolved into a revolutionary who believed he could reshape the world through force of will and strength of arms. Whether that dream would prove to be vision or delusion would soon be tested in the fires of a final confrontation that would make the name of Ned Kelly immortal. Deep in the secluded valleys of the Warby Ranges, where the sound of hammer on anvil would be swallowed by the dense timber and the rushing of hidden creeks, the most ambitious phase of the Kelly saga began to take shape. It was early 1880, and the four outlaws had been fugitives for nearly 2 years, their names spoken in whispers throughout the colony, their faces familiar to every policeman and bounty hunter in Australia. But Ned Kelly was no longer content to merely survive, to play the endless game of cat and mouse with his pursuers. In the long winter nights around their carefully concealed campfires, he had conceived a plan so audacious that it bordered on the impossible. A final stand that would either establish his people's freedom or provide them with a death worthy of legend. The plan centered on armor, iron plate fashioned into suits that would turn their wearers into invulnerable warriors, capable of walking through gunfire as casually as they might walk through rain. It was an idea born of both practical necessity and mythic imagination, a solution to the mathematical certainty that 4 men, no matter how skilled or determined, could not indefinitely evade the hundreds of police officers who hunted them. The inspiration had come from many sources. Joe Byrne, with his classical education, spoke of the knights of medieval romance, men who had been transformed by armor into something more than human. Dan Kelly remembered stories their father had told of ancient Irish warriors who had worn mail shirts into battle against impossible odds. Steve Hart, practical as always, pointed out that armor had been used successfully by bushrangers in other parts of Australia, though never on the scale that Ned was envisioning. But for Ned Kelly himself, the armor represented something deeper than mere protection. It was a symbol of transformation, a way of becoming something that their enemies couldn't understand or defeat. When he wore iron, he would no longer be simply Edward Kelly, the Selector's son who had been driven to outlawry by injustice. He would become something mythic, a figure stepped out of legend to challenge the established order. The creation of the armor required the assistance of sympathizers throughout the region, men who risked their own freedom to help the outlaws realize their impossible dream. Blacksmiths who had known the Kelly family for years found their forges pressed into service, working by night to fashion the plates that would be assembled into suits of armor. Farmers donated scrap iron from their properties. Selectors provided hideouts where the dangerous work could be carried out in secret. The armor itself was crude but effective, fashioned from iron plates roughly 1/8 of an inch thick, held together by leather straps and iron bolts. Each suit weighed nearly 100 pounds, a massive burden that would require tremendous strength and endurance to bear in battle. The helmet was perhaps the most striking element, covering the entire head and face except for a narrow slit through which the wearer could see and breathe. Ned Kelly's suit was the most elaborate, befitting his status as leader of the gang. The breastplate was decorated with Celtic designs that spoke of his Irish heritage, and the helmet was crowned with a plume that would make him unmistakable on any battlefield. When he donned the complete suit for the first time, in a hidden forge deep in the ranges, he was transformed from a man into something altogether more formidable, a figure that seemed to step out of the pages of ancient ballads. The other suits were simpler, but no less effective. Dan Kelly's armor was slightly smaller than his brother's, reflecting his leaner build, but it carried the same sense of invulnerable menace. Joe Burns' suit incorporated modifications that reflected his scholarly nature, additional padding in places where a book-learned man might be less hardened than his companions. Steve Hart's armor was the lightest of the four, designed for a young man whose speed and agility were among his greatest assets. The testing of the armor took place in remote valleys where the sound of gunfire would not carry to hostile ears. One by one, the gang members donned their iron suits and subjected them to increasingly severe trials. Pistol shots fired at close range left only scratches on the iron surface. Rifle bullets, the most dangerous threat they faced, were turned aside or flattened against the metal plates. But the armor was not without its limitations. The weight was enormous, requiring tremendous physical strength to wear for any extended period. The vision slits were narrow, limiting the wearer's field of view and making precise shooting difficult. Most critically, the suits provided no protection for the legs, leaving the wearers vulnerable to shots aimed low. These limitations did not discourage Ned Kelly. If anything, they seemed to inspire him to even greater audacity. If the armor was imperfect, he would compensate by choosing his battlefield carefully, by ensuring that when the final confrontation came, it would be fought on terms that favored his innovations over his enemy's superior numbers. The plan that emerged from months of careful consideration was breathtaking in its scope. The Kelly gang would seize the town of Glenrowan, a small railway settlement in the heart of their home territory. They would hold the town and its inhabitants, using them as shields against police attack, while sending word throughout the region that the time for uprising had come. Sympathizers from the Selector communities would rally to their banner, armed with weapons that had been secretly distributed over the previous months. Together, they would establish a republic in northeastern Victoria, with Glenrowan as its capital and Ned Kelly as its president. The colonial government would be forced to negotiate, to recognize the justice of their cause, to grant them the independence they had earned through years of struggle. It was a plan that required perfect timing, absolute courage, and a degree of popular support that might or might not exist when the moment came to test it. But it offered something that mere survival couldn't do: the possibility of victory, of transforming their personal struggle into something larger and more lasting. The date chosen for the uprising was June 1880, when the winter weather would limit the authorities' ability to bring overwhelming force to bear on Glenrowan. Word was sent through the network of sympathizers, calling on all who supported the Kelly cause to be ready when the signal came. Weapons were distributed, plans were made, and the 4 outlaws prepared themselves for what they all understood would be either their greatest triumph or their final battle. But revolutions, like battles, rarely unfold according to the plans of those who initiate them. The Kelly gang's dream of a northeastern republic would face tests that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. Challenges that would require not just courage and determination, but also the ability to adapt when circumstances refused to conform to expectations. In the hidden camps where they spent their final weeks as free men, the 4 outlaws spoke little of what they expected to happen at Glenrowan. They had made their preparations, chosen their path, and committed themselves to whatever consequences might follow. The armor hung ready in their secret depot. The weapons were cleaned and loaded. The messages had been sent to their supporters throughout the region. All that remained was to don their iron suits and ride to their destiny, to discover whether their dream of freedom could survive contact with the harsh realities of power and politics, or whether they would join the long list of brave men who had died in hopeless causes, their names remembered only in the ballads sung by those who understood the price of defiance. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a selector's hut had become a man who dreamed of reshaping the world through force of arms. The desperate fugitive who had fled into the bush to escape injustice had evolved into a revolutionary who believed that armor and courage could triumph over any odds. Whether that belief would prove to be prophetic or delusional would soon be tested in the flames of a confrontation that would echo through Australian history for generations to come. As the autumn of 1880 approached, bringing with it the anniversary of their first killing at Stringybark Creek, the Kelly gang prepared to make their final throw of the dice. They had survived longer than anyone had thought possible, had achieved more than anyone had expected, had become symbols that transcended their individual lives. Now they faced the ultimate test of their courage and their cause, the moment when all their preparations and sacrifices would be weighed in the balance of history. The iron suits waited in darkness, patient as the armor of sleeping knights in some ancient cathedral. The plan had been made, the words had been spoken, the die had been cast. All that remained was to discover what destiny awaited 4 young men who had dared to challenge an empire with nothing but their courage, their convictions, and their faith in the justice of their cause. The town of Glenrowan drowsed in the winter afternoon of June 26, 1880, unaware that it was about to become the stage for one of the most extraordinary confrontations in Australian history. It was a small place, barely more than a railway station, and a few buildings clustered around the line that connected Melbourne with the Murray River towns, but its position made it strategically vital to the plan that had consumed Ned Kelly's thoughts for months. The Glenrowan Inn stood at the heart of the settlement, a modest 2-story building of weatherboard and iron that served as hotel, meeting place, and social centre for the scattered community. It was owned by Anne Jones, a widow who had always been sympathetic to the Kelly cause, and it was here that the final act of the Kelly saga would unfold with all the inevitability of ancient tragedy. On that quiet Saturday afternoon, the 4 members of the Kelly gang rode into Glenrowan wearing their ordinary clothes, their iron armor hidden in packs carried by their pack horses. To the casual observer, they might have been any group of young men travelling through the district, though those who looked closely might have noticed the quality of their weapons, the alertness of their bearing, the way their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for signs of danger. Ned Kelly dismounted outside the inn with the deliberate movements of a man who understood that he was about to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. At 25, he had grown into the full magnitude of his physical presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that could gentle a horse or crush a man's windpipe with equal ease. His dark eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had looked death in the face and found it less frightening than injustice. Dan Kelly, now 22, moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his youth in the saddle and his recent years living by his wits in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The boy who had once helped his mother with the washing had become a formidable outlaw in his own right, though those who knew him well could still see traces of the gentle nature that circumstances had forced him to suppress. Joe Byrne carried himself with the conscious dignity of an educated man who had chosen to live outside the law rather than submit to what he saw as institutional corruption. At 23, he remained slender and quick, but his movements had acquired the dangerous precision of a man who had learned that survival often depended on the ability to draw and fire a weapon in the space of a heartbeat. Steve Hart, the youngest of them at 21, retained something of the boyish enthusiasm that had marked his entrance into the gang, but it was now tempered by the hard-won wisdom of a man who had survived nearly 3 years as one of the most wanted criminals in Australia. His eyes, bright with intelligence and humour, missed nothing as he surveyed the town that would become their final battlefield. The 4 outlaws entered the inn as the shadows began to lengthen across the small settlement. Inside, they found the usual collection of travellers, locals, and railway workers who made up the inn's clientele on any given day. Anne Jones greeted them with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned to ask no questions of her guests, though her eyes showed that she recognized the men who had just walked into her establishment. What followed was perhaps the strangest evening in the history of Australian outlawry. Instead of announcing their identity and taking control of the inn by force, the Kelly gang simply took seats near the bar and ordered drinks like any other travellers. They spoke quietly among themselves, their voices carrying no threat, their manner giving no indication that they were the most wanted men in the colony. But as the evening progressed, word of their presence spread through the small community with the speed of wildfire. One by one, locals began to appear at the inn, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic presence of men who had become legends in their own lifetime. By nightfall, the modest establishment was crowded with people who had come not to drink or socialize, but to see with their own eyes the outlaws whose names had dominated newspaper headlines for nearly 3 years. Ned Kelly seemed to enjoy the attention, holding court like some medieval king surrounded by his subjects. He spoke freely of their experiences in the bush, of the injustices that had driven them to outlawry, of their hopes for the future. His voice carried the authority of a natural leader, and those who listened found themselves caught up in his vision of a world where poor men could live free from the oppression of the wealthy and powerful. Dan Kelly remained closer to the shadows, his dark eyes watchful, ready for the first sign of treachery or danger. Joe Byrne engaged in philosophical discussions with some of the more educated locals, quoting poetry and discussing the political theories that had shaped his understanding of their struggle. Steve Hart entertained the children who had been brought by their curious parents, performing card tricks and telling stories that made them laugh despite the dangerous circumstances. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the inn took on an almost festive quality. Local musicians appeared with their instruments, and soon the sound of fiddle and accordion filled the room with the ancient melodies of Ireland and Scotland. The Kelly gang joined in the singing, their voices blending with those of their supporters in songs that spoke of exile and rebellion, of heroes who had died for their principles and the people who remembered them. But beneath the apparent celebration lay a tension that every person in the room could feel. The Kelly gang had not come to Glenrowan simply to socialize. They had come to make their final stand, to force a confrontation that would either vindicate their cause or end in their destruction. As the evening progressed, more and more of their supporters began to arrive. Men who had received word through the secret networks that had sustained the outlaws throughout their time in the bush. These were not professional soldiers or experienced revolutionaries, but farmers and laborers, selectors and timber workers who had been ground down by the same system that had produced the Kelly gang. They came armed with shotguns and rifles, pistols, and even farm tools that had been pressed into service as weapons. Their faces showed both determination and fear. They understood the risks they were taking, but they also understood that this might be their only chance to strike back against the forces that had oppressed them all their lives. By midnight, nearly 60 men had gathered in and around the inn, transforming the small railway settlement into something approaching an armed camp. Sentries were posted on the approaches to the town. Horses were readied for whatever action might be required, and weapons were checked and rechecked by men who knew that the morning would likely bring bloodshed. It was then that Ned Kelly revealed the true scope of his plan. Standing before the assembled crowd, he outlined his vision of the republic that would be established in northeastern Victoria, with Glenrowan as its capital and himself as its president. The colonial government would be forced to negotiate, to recognize the justice of their cause, to grant them the independence they had earned through years of struggle. The plan depended on timing and surprise. A special police train carrying reinforcements from Melbourne was expected to pass through Glenrowan in the early hours of the morning. The Kelly gang would derail this train, capturing or killing its passengers and demonstrating to the world that they possessed the power to strike at the very heart of the colonial establishment. Word would then be sent throughout the region, calling on all sympathizers to rally to their banner. Armed groups would seize other strategic points, cutting telegraph lines and blocking roads until the authorities were forced to acknowledge that northeastern Victoria had been liberated from their control. It was a plan born of desperation and sustained by courage, a final throw of the dice by men who had nothing left to lose. Whether it could succeed against the overwhelming resources of the colonial government remained to be seen, but the very audacity of the scheme captured the imagination of those who heard it, outlined in the flickering lamplight of the Glenrowan Inn. As the night progressed toward dawn, the final preparations were made. The railway line was torn up at a point just north of the town, creating a gap that would send any approaching train crashing into the embankment. Trees were felled across the roads, creating barriers that would slow any police reinforcements attempting to reach the town by land. Most dramatically, the 4 members of the Kelly gang donned their iron armor, transforming themselves from ordinary men into something that seemed to step out of the pages of medieval romance. The weight of the metal was enormous, but they bore it with the stoic determination of men who understood that their very survival depended on the protection it provided. Ned Kelly's armor was the most elaborate, its Celtic decorations and plumed helmet marking him as the leader of this strange army. When he emerged from the inn in full regalia, a murmur of awe ran through the assembled crowd. Here was their champion, their knight in armor, ready to lead them against the forces of oppression. The other 3 gang members presented equally impressive figures in their iron suits. Dan Kelly moved with surprising grace despite the weight of his armor, his natural athleticism allowing him to adapt quickly to the constraints of metal and leather. Joe Byrne had added books and papers to his equipment, determined that if he died this day, his intellectual legacy would survive him. Steve Hart retained his boyish grin even beneath the stern mask of his helmet, finding humor even in the face of almost certain death. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the winter sky, a lookout posted on the railway line came running back to town with the news that everyone had been waiting for. The special police train was approaching, its headlight cutting through the morning mist like a malevolent eye. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything they had planned, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had dreamed of achieving would be decided in the next few hours. The Kelly gang took their positions, their iron armor gleaming dully in the pale light, their weapons ready, their hearts beating with the terrible excitement of men who were about to discover whether their cause was just enough to overcome impossible odds. But revolution, like battle, seldom unfolds according to the plans of those who initiate it. As the sound of the approaching train grew louder, carrying with it the weight of the colonial government's determination to end the Kelly saga once and for all, the 4 outlaws prepared to discover whether their iron dreams could survive contact with the harsh realities of power and politics. The boy who had learned his letters by firelight in a selector's hut was about to become either the president of a new republic or another casualty in the long struggle between rich and poor. The man who had donned armor to make himself invulnerable was about to test whether iron and courage could triumph over numbers and authority. In the growing light of what would become known as Black Monday, June 28, 1880, the final act of the Kelly saga was about to begin. The stage was set, the players were in position, and history waited to see whether 4 young men in iron suits could change the world or would simply add their names to the long list of brave men who had died in hopeless causes. The sound of the train grew louder, its whistle echoing across the winter landscape like a cry of warning. In a few moments, the Kelly gang would discover whether their dreams of freedom were prophecy or delusion, whether their iron armor was protection or merely an elaborate shroud. The special train thundered through the grey dawn toward Glenrowan, carrying 22 heavily armed constables and 4 black trackers whose job was to hunt down the Kelly gang once and for all. Superintendent Francis Hare commanded the expedition, an experienced police officer who had spent months studying the outlaws' methods and preparing for this final confrontation. The train's locomotive threw sparks into the winter air as it raced through the countryside, its whistle cutting through the morning silence like a war cry. But as the train approached the section of a track that had been torn up during the night, disaster struck with mechanical inevitability. The locomotive hit the gap at full speed, its wheels catching on the twisted rails before the entire engine pitched forward into the embankment with a crash that could be heard for miles. Cars telescoped into each other, steam hissed from ruptured boilers, and the carefully planned police operation dissolved into chaos and confusion. Several constables were killed instantly in the wreck, their bodies crushed beneath tons of twisted metal. Others were injured too severely to continue the fight, leaving the survivors stunned and disoriented as they struggled to extract themselves from the wreckage. Superintendent Hare himself was wounded, a piece of shattered glass cutting deep into his leg and effectively removing him from command of the operation. From their positions around the town, the Kelly gang and their supporters watched the destruction with grim satisfaction. The plan had worked exactly as Ned Kelly had envisioned. The forces of authority had been dealt a crippling blow before they could even begin their assault on Glenrowan. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the impossible dream of the Northeastern Republic might actually become reality. But the celebration was premature. The train wreck had been spectacular, but it had not eliminated all of the police force, and word of the disaster was already speeding along the telegraph lines to Melbourne. Within hours, every available constable in the colony would be converging on Glenrowan, backed by military units if necessary. The Kelly gang had won the first engagement, but the war was far from over. More immediately, the survivors of the train wreck were regrouping under the leadership of Senior Constable Kelly. No relation to the outlaws, despite the shared name. These men were professional police officers, experienced in bushcraft and armed with the latest rifles. They were outnumbered by the motley collection of sympathizers gathered around the inn, but they possessed superior training and discipline. As the morning progressed, a strange sort of siege developed around Glenrowan. The police took up positions in the timber surrounding the town, using the cover of trees and undergrowth to move closer to their targets. The Kelly gang and their supporters held the inn and the center of the settlement, protected by the buildings, but essentially trapped within the perimeter that the police were drawing around them. Shots began to be exchanged as the two forces probed each other's defenses. The bark of rifles echoed across the winter landscape, punctuated by the sharper crack of pistols and the occasional boom of shotguns. But this was not the decisive battle that either side had expected. Instead, it was a deadly game of hide and seek, with both groups trying to gain advantage while avoiding the casualties that would come from direct confrontation. Inside the inn, the atmosphere was tense, but not panicked. The Kelly gang moved among their supporters, offering encouragement and tactical advice, their iron armor making them strangely reassuring figures in the chaos of battle. Ned Kelly seemed almost calm, as if the long months of anticipation had prepared him for this moment, and he was finally at peace with his destiny. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the situation was deteriorating. The police were receiving reinforcements, while the Kelly supporters were gradually slipping away as the reality of their situation became apparent. What had seemed like a glorious uprising in the darkness of the night was beginning to look more like a desperate last stand in the harsh light of day. The first serious casualty among the outlaws came when Joe Byrne was struck by a police bullet that found one of the gaps in his armor. The educated member of the gang, the man who had quoted poetry around their campfires and dreamed of literary immortality, fell to the floor of the inn with blood spreading across his chest. His companions gathered around him, but it was clear that the wound was mortal. Joe Byrne died as he had lived, with dignity and courage, his last words a quotation from one of the poems he had memorized during his brief education. His death marked the beginning of the end for the Kelly gang, the first crack in the armor of invincibility that had protected them through nearly 3 years of outlawry. As the afternoon wore on, the police tightened their cordon around the inn. More reinforcements arrived from Melbourne, including military units with heavy weapons that could punch through the wooden walls of the building. The Kelly supporters, realizing that they were trapped in an impossible situation, began to negotiate for safe passage for the civilians who had been caught up in the battle. It was then that Ned Kelly made the decision that would define his place in history. Rather than remain trapped in the inn with his remaining companions, he would don his armor and make a frontal assault on the police positions, drawing their fire away from the building and giving the others a chance to escape. It was a decision born of desperation, but it was also the action of a man who understood that leadership sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice. Strapping on the iron suit that had taken months to create, Ned Kelly prepared for his final appearance on the stage of history. The armor that had been designed to make him invulnerable would now be tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Whether it would protect him long enough to achieve his objectives remained to be seen. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart watched their leader prepare for what they all understood would be his last battle. The boys who had followed him into the bush were now men who had learned the true cost of defiance, and they understood that their own survival depended on the courage of their elder brother and leader. as Ned Kelly checked his weapons one final time, adjusting the weight of his armor and preparing to step out into the open ground between the inn and the police positions, he might have thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The boy who had walked beside his father down the track to Beveridge had become a man who was about to challenge an empire with nothing but iron and courage. The sun was setting over Glenrowan, painting the sky the color of blood and casting long shadows across the battlefield. Soon, the most famous individual action in Australian criminal history would begin, as a man in homemade armor walked out to face the assembled forces of colonial authority in a confrontation that would echo through generations. The time for planning was over. The moment for compromise had passed. All that remained was to discover whether Ned Kelly's iron dreams could survive their final test, or whether they would die with him in the mud and gun smoke of a small Victorian town that had never asked to become the stage for such an extraordinary drama. The sun was dying behind the hills west of Glenrowan, painting the winter sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to mirror the flames that would soon consume the little town. Inside the inn, the remaining members of the Kelly gang prepared for what they all understood would be their final stand. The building was surrounded, escape was impossible, and the police were preparing to assault their stronghold with overwhelming force. Dan Kelly moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had accepted his fate. At 22, he had spent 3 years living as an outlaw, 3 years of constant danger and hardship that had aged him beyond his years. Now, as he checked his weapons one last time, there was something almost peaceful in his manner, as if the long uncertainty was finally at an end. Steve Hart retained his boyish grin even in the face of death, finding humor and hope where others might see only despair. The youngest of the gang, he had followed his companions into outlawry with the unquestioning loyalty of youth, and he would follow them into death with the same courage that had marked his entire association with the Kelly name. But it was Ned Kelly who commanded attention as he made his final preparations. The iron armor that had taken months to create and had become the symbol of his impossible dream was strapped into place piece by piece, transforming him from a man into something that seemed to step out of the pages of ancient legend. The breastplate with its Celtic decorations, the helmet with its narrow vision slit, the arm and leg guards that would protect him from all but the most precisely aimed shots. Each piece was a statement of defiance, a refusal to surrender to the forces that had driven him to this place. When the armor was complete, Ned Kelly stood in the flickering lamplight of the inn, like some medieval knight preparing for battle. The weight of the iron was enormous, nearly 100 pounds of metal and leather that would have staggered a lesser man. But Kelly bore it with the steady strength of someone who had spent his entire life doing hard, physical labor, his broad shoulders and powerful frame easily supporting the load that would protect him in the fight to come. Outside, the police were making their own preparations. Word had reached them that the outlaws were planning to attempt a breakout, and every available man had been positioned to prevent escape. Rifles were loaded and checked, positions were assigned, and orders were given that there would be no quarter offered to men who had killed 3 constables and defied the authority of the Crown for nearly 3 years. The plan that Ned Kelly had conceived was simple in its audacity. He would walk out of the inn alone, drawing the fire of the police onto himself, while his companions attempted to escape in the confusion. His armor would protect him from their bullets, allowing him to fight his way through their positions and disappear into the bush he knew better than any of his pursuers. It was a plan that depended entirely on the effectiveness of his iron suit, on his own physical strength and courage, and on the psychological impact of a figure that seemed to emerge from the realm of nightmare and legend. Whether it could succeed against trained police officers armed with modern rifles remained to be seen. As full darkness settled over Glenrowan, Ned Kelly said his farewells to his brother and his friend. There were no speeches, no dramatic proclamations, just the quiet words of men who had shared everything and who understood that they might never see each other again. Dan Kelly gripped his brother's armored hand, feeling the cold metal that had become a barrier between them. Steve Hart offered a jest that made them all smile, despite the circumstances. Then Ned Kelly turned towards the door of the inn, his iron-shod feet ringing on the wooden floor with each step. Anne Jones, the innkeeper who had sheltered them through this final night, stepped aside as the armored figure approached the threshold that would lead him either to freedom or to death. For a moment, Kelly paused in the doorway, his helmeted head turning as if he were taking one last look at the place that had been his final refuge. Through the narrow slit in his visor, he could see the lights of the police positions scattered through the timber around the town, could hear the low voices of men preparing for battle, could smell the wood smoke and gun oil that marked the presence of armed enemies. Then he stepped out into the night, and the final act of the Kelly saga began. The first shots came almost immediately. Police marksmen who had been watching the inn opened fire as soon as they saw the strange figure emerge from the building. Bullets struck Kelly's armor with sharp metallic rings, the sound echoing across the winter landscape like some deadly percussion. But the iron held, turning aside the lead that would have killed any unprotected man. Kelly began to walk toward the police positions, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the storm of bullets that surrounded him. In his hands he carried a revolver and a shotgun, weapons that he used with the skill of a man who had been fighting for his life for 3 years. His shots were carefully aimed, forcing the police to take cover and disrupting their attempts to concentrate their fire on the gaps in his armor. The psychological effect of his appearance was everything he had hoped for, and more. Police officers who had faced dangerous criminals throughout their careers found themselves confronting something that seemed to belong more to the realm of supernatural terror than to ordinary law enforcement. The figure advancing toward them through the gunfire appeared invulnerable, unstoppable, like some ancient warrior returned from the dead to exact vengeance on his enemies. Cries of "He's got armor" and "Aim for his legs" rang out across the battlefield as the police tried to adapt their tactics to this unprecedented threat. But Kelly's advance continued, his iron-shod feet carrying him steadily forward through the hail of bullets that seemed unable to stop him. For nearly half an hour, the incredible advance continued. Kelly fought his way from cover to cover, using trees and buildings to shield himself while he reloaded his weapons and planned his next move. The police, despite their superior numbers and firepower, found themselves falling back before the assault of a single man who seemed to be protected by supernatural forces. But iron, no matter how thick, was not truly invulnerable. The suit that had been designed to protect Kelly from rifle fire had one fatal flaw. It provided no protection for his legs below the knee. The police, once they recovered from their initial shock, began to concentrate their fire on this vulnerable area. The first shot to find its mark struck Kelly in the foot, the bullet shattering bone and sending him stumbling. But he kept walking, his iron will overcoming the pain and shock of the wound. A second shot struck his leg, then a third. But still the armored figure continued his advance toward the police lines. It was only when a well-aimed shot struck him behind the knee, severing important blood vessels and dropping him to the ground, that Ned Kelly's final advance came to an end. Even then, he attempted to rise, to continue the fight that had consumed his entire adult life. But the weight of his armor, combined with the loss of blood from multiple wounds, finally proved too much even for his enormous strength. The police surrounded the fallen outlaw with a mixture of relief and amazement. They had expected to face a dangerous criminal, but they had found themselves confronting something that seemed to step out of the pages of ancient legend. As they removed his helmet and looked into the face of the man who had defied them for so long, they saw not a monster, but a young man whose dark eyes still burned with unquenchable defiance. "Such is life," Ned Kelly reportedly said as they lifted him from the ground. And in those 3 words was captured the philosophy that had sustained him through years of struggle and suffering. Life was hard. Life was unfair. But life was still worth living and worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible and defeat was certain. Behind them, the Glenrowan Inn had burst into flames, whether by accident or design. In the light of the fire, the remaining members of the Kelly gang made their own final stand. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they would not survive the night, their weapons speaking in the darkness until they were silenced forever by the overwhelming firepower of their enemies. When dawn broke over Glenrowan on June 29th, 1880, the Kelly gang was finished. 3 of its members lay dead in the ruins of the inn, while the 4th was a prisoner, wounded and defeated, but still alive. The dream of the Northeastern Republic had died in the flames and gunsmoke of a single night, but the legend of the Kelly gang had been born in those same flames, destined to burn in the imagination of future generations. As Ned Kelly was carried away to face trial for his life, he might have reflected on the journey that had brought him from the Selector's hut, where he had learned his letters, to the battlefield where he had made his final stand. The boy who had dreamed of lifting his family from poverty had become a man whose name would be remembered long after the poverty that had shaped him was forgotten. Whether he had succeeded or failed in his ultimate objectives would be debated for generations to come. But there could be no doubt that he had lived and died according to his own principles, had refused to be broken, by forces that had crushed lesser men, had transformed himself from victim into symbol, in a way that would inspire some and terrify others for as long as stories were told around campfires in the Australian bush. The armour lay scattered in the mud of Glenrowan, its iron plates dented and torn by the bullets that had finally brought down the last of the bushrangers. But the spirit that had animated that armour, the refusal to submit to injustice that had driven a poor Irish Catholic selector's son to challenge an empire, would prove more durable than any metal ever forged. The courtroom in Melbourne fell silent as Edward Kelly was brought before the bar of justice, his wounds barely healed, his legend already growing beyond the walls that confined him. It was October of 1880, and the colony of Victoria had waited months for this moment, the trial of the man who had defied authority longer and more spectacularly than any outlaw in Australian history. Judge Redmond Barry presided over the proceedings, a man whose very presence seemed to embody the weight and majesty of British justice. He was old, distinguished, his white hair and stern countenance marking him as a representative of the established order that Ned Kelly had spent 3 years fighting. When he looked down at the prisoner in the dock, he saw not a romantic figure or a champion of the oppressed, but a criminal who had murdered police officers and terrorized the countryside. Kelly himself stood in the dock with the quiet dignity that had marked his conduct throughout his career as an outlaw. The wounds he had received at Glenrowan had healed, but they had left him walking with a slight limp that served as a permanent reminder of his final battle. His dark eyes surveyed the courtroom with the same steady gaze that had once read the bush for signs of pursuit, taking in the faces of those who would judge him, and finding there the same mixture of fear and fascination that his name had inspired throughout the colony. The trial itself was largely a formality. The evidence against Kelly was overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses testified to his participation in the murders at Stringybark Creek, the bank robberies at Euroa and Jerilderie, the final siege at Glenrowan. The only real question was whether the jury would find him guilty of murder, which carried the death penalty, or the lesser charge of manslaughter. Kelly's defense lawyer, David Gaunson, did his best to present his client as a victim of circumstances rather than a cold-blooded killer. He spoke of the harassment the Kelly family had endured, the poverty that had driven them to desperation, the corruption of the police force that had left them no recourse to legal justice. But his words fell on ears that had been deafened by years of official propaganda portraying the Kelly gang as dangerous criminals who had chosen violence over law. When given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, Kelly rose with the same calm authority that had marked his leadership of the gang. His voice, strengthened by years of calling commands across the ranges, carried clearly to every corner of the crowded courtroom as he began what would become one of the most famous speeches in Australian legal history. He spoke not as a man begging for mercy, but as someone explaining the choices that had led him to this place. He told of the injustices his family had suffered, the harassment by police who saw Irish Catholics as natural criminals, the corruption of a system that served the wealthy while grinding the poor into the dirt. His words carried the weight of accumulated grievance and the power of a man who believed absolutely in the justice of his cause. "I have been wrongfully sentenced," he declared, his dark eyes fixed on Judge Barry. "I have been in trouble for something I never done at all. I have never killed a man in my life except in self-defense, and if I had been given justice, I would never have taken the path I did." But the courtroom was not the bush, and legal argument wasn't the same as armed resistance. The jury, composed of respectable citizens who shared the social background and prejudices of those Kelly had fought against, deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Judge Barry donned the black cap that marked the pronouncement of a death sentence with the same ceremony that had accompanied such moments for centuries. His voice, when he spoke, carried the full weight of British law and imperial authority as he pronounced the words that would seal Ned Kelly's fate. "Edward Kelly," he intoned, "you have been found guilty of willful murder, and it is my duty to pronounce upon you the sentence of the law. That sentence is that you be taken from here to the place whence you came, and thence to a place of execution, and that you there be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." Kelly's response entered immediately into Australian folklore. Looking directly at the judge, who had just sentenced him to death, he replied with the quiet dignity that had marked his entire trial, "I will go a little further than that, and say I will see you there, where I go." The words carried no threat, no bravado, simply the calm certainty of a man who understood that death came to all men, regardless of their position in society. It was a response that crystallized everything Kelly represented: the refusal to be intimidated by authority, the belief that justice existed on a higher plane than human law, the conviction that his cause would ultimately be vindicated. In the weeks that followed his sentencing, Kelly became the center of a debate that divided the colony. Petitions for commutation of his death sentence gathered thousands of signatures, many from people who had never met him, but who saw in his struggle something that resonated with their own experiences of injustice and oppression. Public meetings were held, newspapers editorialized, and politicians found themselves forced to take positions on whether the last of the Kelly gang should live or die. His supporters argued that Kelly was more victim than criminal, a man who had been driven to outlawry by the systematic persecution of his family and community. They pointed to the corruption in the police force, the harassment of Irish Catholics, the impossible conditions faced by selectors trying to make a living from marginal land. In their view, Kelly was a symbol of resistance to oppression, a man who had refused to be broken by an unjust system. His opponents saw him as a dangerous criminal who had murdered police officers in the performance of their duty and terrorized innocent citizens throughout his career. They argued that allowing him to escape the death penalty would encourage other discontents to take up arms against lawful authority, undermining the very foundations of civilized society. In his cell in Melbourne jail, Kelly waited with the same patience he had shown during his years in the bush. He was allowed visitors, and many came, old friends from the Selector communities, sympathetic journalists, religious figures seeking to prepare his soul for the hereafter. To all of them, he maintained the same quiet dignity, neither glorying in his notoriety nor expressing regret for the choices that had brought him to this place. Ellen Kelly, his mother, was among his most frequent visitors. The woman who had raised her children in poverty and hardship, who had watched her eldest son disappear into the bush to become the most famous outlaw in Australia, now faced the prospect of seeing him executed by the state. Their conversations, conducted under the watchful eyes of prison guards, were private, but those who observed them noted the unbroken bond between mother and son, the love that neither time nor circumstance had been able to destroy. As the date set for his execution approached, Kelly spent his time writing letters and composing what would become his final statement to the world. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, filled page after page with reflections on his life, his struggles, and the causes that had driven him to take up arms against the established order. He showed no fear of death, but neither did he seek martyrdom. He had lived according to his principles and would die according to them, facing whatever came with the same courage that had sustained him through 3 years as an outlaw. In his final letters, he expressed hope that his death might serve some purpose, might help to bring about the reforms that he had tried to achieve through armed resistance. The last entry in his prison diary, written on the night before his execution, revealed something of the man behind the legend. "It is a dreadful thing to think that I am going to die tomorrow, but I am not afraid to die. I die for my country and my principles, and I hope that God will forgive me for the men I have killed." Outside the walls of Melbourne jail, crowds gathered as the date of execution approached. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others to show support for a man they saw as a hero, still others to ensure that justice was finally done to a dangerous criminal. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the passion that Kelly's name had always inspired. As dawn broke on November 11th, 1880, the final preparations were made for the execution that would end one of the most extraordinary careers in Australian history. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a selector's hut, the young man who had donned iron armor to challenge an empire, was about to discover whether death would bring him the peace that life had never offered. The morning of November 11th, 1880, dawned grey and cold over Melbourne, with a winter wind that carried the scent of rain and the weight of endings. In his cell in Melbourne jail, Edward Kelly woke for the last time as a living man, rising from the narrow bed where he had spent his final night to face the day that would see his name pass from the realm of current events into the domain of legend. He had slept little, but sleep had never come easily to a man who had spent 3 years listening for the approach of enemies in the darkness. Now, in the grey light filtering through the barred window of his cell, he moved with the same deliberate calm that had marked his conduct throughout his imprisonment. There was no hurry now, no need to watch the approaches or plan the next move. The game was over, and all that remained was to play the final hand with the dignity that had sustained him through everything else. Father Dean, the Catholic priest who had become Kelly's spiritual advisor during his final weeks, arrived early to offer the consolations of religion to a man who was about to meet his maker. Kelly received him with the same quiet courtesy he had shown to all his visitors, kneeling to receive the sacraments, with the simple faith of a man who had been raised in the Irish Catholic tradition, despite everything that had happened, to challenge his belief in divine justice. "I bear no malice toward any man," Kelly told the priest as they prayed together in the small cell. "I have done what I believed was right, and I am prepared to face whatever judgment awaits me." His voice was steady, showing no trace of the fear that might have been expected from a man facing imminent death. Outside the prison walls, crowds had been gathering since before dawn. Some came out of morbid curiosity, drawn by the spectacle of a famous man's final moments. Others came to show support for someone they saw as a champion of the common people, a man who had refused to be broken by an unjust system. Still others came to ensure that justice was finally done to a dangerous criminal who had defied authority for too long. The mixture of fascination and division that Kelly inspired was evident in the faces of those who pressed against the prison gates. There were selectors and laborers who saw in him a symbol of their own struggles against poverty and oppression. There were respectable citizens who viewed him as a dangerous criminal whose death would restore order to the colony. There were Irish Catholics who saw in him a martyr to British injustice, and English Protestants who saw only a murderer getting his just deserts. Inside the prison, Kelly ate his final breakfast, simple fare that he consumed without complaint, as he had consumed everything else that life had offered him. The prison governor, John Castio, found himself oddly moved by the condemned man's composure. In his years of overseeing executions, he had seen men break down in terror, beg for mercy, or rage against their fate. But Kelly faced death with the same steady courage that had marked his entire career, neither seeking pity nor offering defiance. "He meets his fate like a man," Castio would later write in his official report. "Whatever his crimes, no one can say that Edward Kelly died a coward's death." As the morning progressed toward the appointed hour of 10 o'clock, Kelly was allowed to write his final letters. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, covered the pages with words of farewell to his family, expressions of gratitude to those who had supported him, and final reflections on the life he was about to leave behind. To his mother, Ellen, he wrote with the tenderness of a son who had never forgotten the woman who had raised him in poverty and love. "Dear mother, do not fret for me. I have lived as I thought best, and I die without regret for the choices I have made. Take care of the little ones, and remember that whatever happens, you have raised your children to know the difference between right and wrong." To his surviving sisters, he offered advice and encouragement, urging them to live honest lives and to remember that the Kelly name, despite everything that had happened, was one to be carried with pride. "We have never bowed our heads to injustice, and you must not bow yours either. But use your minds rather than your fists, and perhaps you can achieve what I couldn't." As the hour of execution approached, Kelly was visited by the hangman, a professional executioner brought from Sydney for the occasion. The man, whose name was never recorded for posterity, found himself face to face with the most famous criminal in Australian history, and he was struck by Kelly's calm demeanor. "Any last requests?" the hangman asked, following the traditional protocol. Kelly looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen so much in their 25 years. "Make it quick," he said simply. "I've been waiting long enough." The walk from his cell to the gallows was the longest and shortest journey of Kelly's life. Each step carried him further from the world he had known, closer to whatever lay beyond the veil of death. The prison officials who accompanied him noted that he walked with steady steps, his head held high, showing no sign of the fear that might have been expected from a man approaching his own execution. The gallows stood in the prison yard, a simple wooden structure that had seen the end of many lives, but none so famous as the one it was about to claim. A small crowd of official witnesses had gathered, government officials, newspaper reporters, representatives of the law whose authority Kelly had defied for so long. They watched in silence as the condemned man approached the place where his story would end. Kelly stood on the trapdoor and submitted to the placement of the hood over his head, the adjustment of the noose around his neck. In the darkness beneath the black cloth, he spoke his final words, words that would be remembered and repeated as long as his story was told. Such is life. 3 simple words that captured everything he had learned in his brief passage through the world. Life was hard. Life was unfair. Life was often brief and brutal, but it was also precious, worth fighting for, worth living according to one's own principles, even when those principles led to the gallows. In those 3 words was contained the philosophy that had sustained him through years of struggle and had brought him at last to this moment of final reckoning. The trapdoor opened with a sound like thunder, and Edward Kelly fell into eternity. His neck broke cleanly, ending his life in an instant and sparing him the prolonged agony that sometimes accompanied such executions. The body that had carried him through 25 years of triumph and tragedy, love and loss, swayed gently in the morning breeze for a few moments before hanging still. Outside the prison walls, the crowd heard the dull thud of the falling trap and knew that the Kelly saga had finally ended. Some cheered, some wept, some simply stood in silence as they contemplated the passing of a man who had become larger than life. The debates about his legacy would continue for generations, but the man himself was gone, his voice silenced forever. The authorities buried Kelly's body in the prison grounds, in an unmarked grave intended to prevent it from becoming a shrine for his supporters. But they could not bury his memory so easily. The stories began almost immediately. Tales of his courage, his loyalty to his family, his refusal to submit to what he saw as injustice. In the pubs and shearing sheds of rural Australia, men who had never met him spoke of him as if he had been their brother. His mother, Ellen Kelly, outlived her famous son by 33 years, carrying with her until her own death in 1923 the memory of the boy who had tried to lift his family from poverty and had ended up on the gallows instead. She never spoke publicly about his execution, but those who knew her said that she never stopped believing that he had been more victim than criminal, more hero than villain. The iron armor that had made Kelly's final stand possible was displayed in museums, where visitors came to marvel at the crude but effective protection that had allowed one man to walk through gunfire like something out of ancient legend. Children pressed their faces against the glass cases, trying to imagine what it must have been like to wear such a burden, to carry such weight in the name of an impossible dream. The bush where Kelly had learned his craft as an outlaw remained largely unchanged, though the Selector's huts gradually gave way to more substantial farms as the colony prospered and grew. But in the hills and valleys where he had hidden from his pursuers, where he had planned his raids and dreamed his dreams of a republic where poor men could live free, his memory lingered like smoke from a long-dead campfire. In the years that followed his death, Kelly became something more than he had ever been in life. He became a symbol, a touchstone for those who felt themselves oppressed by authority, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions could be challenged by determined individuals who refused to submit to injustice. Politicians invoked his name, writers crafted stories around his legend, and artists painted portraits that tried to capture the essence of a man who had defied an empire with nothing but courage and iron. But perhaps the truest monument to Ned Kelly wasn't found in any museum or gallery, but in the memories of ordinary people who kept his story alive around kitchen tables and campfires, who told their children about the Bushranger who had worn iron armor and refused to surrender, who had died with dignity even as his enemies celebrated his defeat. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a selector's hut had become a man whose story would be read for generations to come. The desperate fugitive who had fled into the bush to escape injustice had evolved into a legend that would outlive the system he had fought against. Whether he had succeeded or failed in his ultimate objectives remained a matter of debate, but there could be no doubt that he had achieved a kind of immortality that his executioners had never intended to grant him.